all our national holidays, majority rule is probably the one that's least understood and appreciated by this current generation of students. Our young people, I don't think, appreciate the fight, the struggle that prior generations had to go through in order to see that moment occur. You know, majority rule could easily be thought of as a singular moment, and it is in a way. It's a national holiday. But if we think about that onion and we peel back the layers, we have to go back to what Doris Johnson referred to as a quiet revolution, a period we could argue that started in 1942 with the Burma Road riot and culminated with that eventful general election in 1967. Now, what happened in between? I would say some of the more dramatic moments in our Bahamian political history occurs during those two bookshelf, bookend sort of moments. In 42, of course, you had a riot that led to several persons being killed, but ultimately the issue of wages, 4 shillings versus 8, didn't really get resolved outside of an increase of 1 shilling. But it was, as scholars have now pointed out, it was sort of the first shot being fired in a quiet revolution. It was the first pebble in the pond where you have a ripple effect. It led to the Labor Day parade in '56. You have the awakening of Bahamians, as Virgil Story and Nona Martin have said. That political awakening also led to the general strike in '58, right, where people are now demanding change. Rampant racism that was orchestrated by the UBP was no longer going to be tolerated. So when they tried to give direct preferential contracts to white tour operators as opposed to black taxi drivers, you have Clifford Darling, who is going to along with his unionists, are going to blockade the road to the airport. Of course, 2 months later, after trying to negotiate with the UBP, they realized that that was just folly. And so by the early part of January '58, he goes to Randall Fox and says, these guys just playing with us. We need to strike, and we need to strike in solidarity as a full group of labor organizers. So they did a vote near midnight. The next day, you have Fox and Pinling walking into, I think it was the Emerald Beach Hotel. They put their hands on Shop Stewart Campbell's shoulders and said, now. And that they didn't have to say much. They just had to say now. Everyone walked off their job. And for basically 16 days, you had a real general strike. That shows the political maturation of the people, this awakening, this sort of awareness or consciousness of the trouble and the environment that they had. And as John Lewis would say, it was good trouble. They had to sort of shake the tree. They had to ruffle the feathers of the UBP. That's why by the early 60s, you see massive demonstrations being orchestrated. And the most famous, of course, is April 27th, 1965, that Black Tuesday moment where the mace and the hourglass are thrown out of the House of Assembly. And it was a peaceful demonstration. It was completely orchestrated and organized by members of the National Committee for Positive Action and others sort of in the vanguard of the movement of the PLP. And so they marched from Bay Street after, and this is very important because people think it's just about the mace and hourglass. No, it was about the mass mobilization of people and then being able to peacefully move off of Bay Street to Southern Recreation Grounds. So that's all the building blocks in place to lead us to 67. 67 would not have happened, I would add, if it wasn't for the electoral changes that needed to take place after the '62 election. And so all of the demonstrations, particularly the Black Tuesday incident, was around electoral reform that, you know, in the House they'd been debating for at least 2 weeks the boundaries and the Boundary Commission and how it had been gerrymandered in '62 so that it would benefit, of course, the UBP. Right? PLP won the popular vote in '62 but still lost the election. So in '67 and '65, there's a need for a more equitable arrangement of the constituency boundaries. And so then the demonstration in '65 leads directly to '67 because in '67 we have a fair and equitable system in place. We have one person, one vote. We have constituency boundaries that are fairer than '62. It gives the chance for the people to have a voice. And so the penultimate moment, of course, is the election. Now you have an 18-18 tie, you have a deadlock, and so there has to be some compromise or consensus has to be built. And so Pinling is able to reach out and get, of course, the Labor leader, Randall Fox, to join, and he becomes the Labor minister, that's Randall Fox. And then, of course, you have Alvin Brennan, a disgruntled UBP turned independent, who becomes the Speaker of the House. So it's because of that moment of negotiation that we ultimately do have a majority rule, a moment in Bahamian history that has been remembered by past generations as a point in which the world had turned upside down. In our world, I mean, because you had the minority rule for over 250 years dismantled, and you have a revolution of kind in which a new government is established that represents the people's interests. And what I mean by that, it's not necessarily about color, but it's about destroying a class system and an oligarchy that is ruled by a conservative group of like-minded individuals who are trying to repress the common goals and collective initiatives of the people. And so education was denied to the majority of people before 67. Education was a privilege instead of a right. You have the underdevelopment of the family islands. You have no hospitals, clinics, roads, electricity, public amenities, things that you think are basic needs that people ought to have. They did not have that before 67. So you see concerted efforts after 67 to make education a right rather than a privilege. You see the expansion of infrastructure in the family islands under Cecil Wallace Whitfield and later ministers of work. You have a concerted effort to make the Bahamas a nation. And from 67, of course, to 73, you have this steady march towards national sovereignty and independence. So 67 is a day that needs to be celebrated because of its momentous change, because of what it got rid of and what it achieved. It was the flowering of democracy. It was a moment in our country's history, a seminal moment where we could be proud to be Bahamian. We no longer had to learn English history and English literature. We no longer had to learn about British geography. We could say we are a people who have been formed and forged out of the archipelago, and we are proud to stand tall as we march forward, upward, onward, together. It was a coalition government because, as I mentioned, there had to be compromise and negotiation. Right. So, and interestingly, in '56, Randall Fox was a PLP candidate. He was one of the Magnificent Six. But he fell out of favor with the PLP, and he was thought of as too much of a firebrand orator, and his rhetoric was in some ways vitriolic. So he had left the PLP, and of course he was running on the Labor ticket as a Labor leader in '67. And so it was a compromise, it was a coalition, but it was necessary in order to form a majority government. A coalition government could not work in 2026 because we have a new system. We have a two-party system that was really birthed by 1971, okay, with the emergence of the Free National Movement out of the embers and ashes of the UBP, and of course, merging with the Free PLP. And so I'm saying that you could not have that in 2026 because we have two strong legacy parties, and the third parties that we see that exist today, they don't have the kind of base that would elicit a kind of compromise from a third party perspective. Majority rule is a seminal moment, but it's an unfinished product. So that means that you have to continue the journey to achieve gender equality. You have to continue the journey towards achieving better representation in the family islands. So the consideration that we might give to reforming our system is to look at moving towards a republic, or working towards configuring a federal system where the family islands get better representation other than just local government, which, as you know, doesn't actually have a play in House of Parliament per se. And so some would argue that it doesn't really have the voice that it needs to have, an amplified voice, in order to affect real change in the family islands.